welcome to Mail Story. If you enjoy stories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next ones.
My mother-in-law made me late to my own wedding by locking me in the bridal suite bathroom and telling everyone I was having second thoughts about marrying her son. She arrived at the venue early claiming she wanted to help me get ready, but instead created chaos by hiding my shoes, misplacing my veil, and accidentally spilling coffee on my first dress, so I had to wear the backup. When it was time to walk down the aisle, Dorothy said she needed to speak with me privately about something important regarding her son's future. She led me to the bathroom to fix my lipstick, and while I was looking in the mirror, she stepped out and locked the door from the outside with a key she'd gotten from venue staff by claiming she was the wedding planner. I pounded on the door and screamed for help, but Dorothy had sent the bridesmaids on fake errands and told them I needed complete silence to meditate before the ceremony. The music started and stopped 3 times while I was trapped in that bathroom, and Dorothy told the 200 guests that I was having a panic attack about the commitment. She actually stood at the altar next to her son Kevin and announced that some people weren't ready for the responsibility of marriage, and maybe this was a sign we should reconsider. She suggested to everyone that perhaps we should postpone the wedding until I was more mature and ready for such a serious step. Meanwhile, I was screaming myself hoarse in a locked bathroom while my father searched the venue for me. When maintenance finally broke down the door 45 minutes later, I ran to the ceremony in tears with smeared makeup, and Dorothy immediately said, "See everyone, she's clearly too emotional for this." The ceremony proceeded, but Dorothy had already planted seeds of doubt in everyone's minds about whether I really wanted to marry Kevin. She whispered during the vows that forced marriages never worked out, and loudly sighed when I said I do like she knew something nobody else did. During the reception, she gave a speech about how she'd tried to help me get ready, but I'd been too stressed and unstable to accept assistance. She said she hoped Kevin knew what he was getting into with someone who couldn't even handle wedding day pressure without having a breakdown. She told the story of finding me locked in the bathroom like I'd done it to myself from anxiety, and she'd been the one trying to help. That's when I decided Dorothy needed to experience what missing important moments felt like. I started with the anniversary party that she'd been planning for a year to renew her vows with Kevin's father. The morning of the event, I called the venue pretending to be Dorothy and canceled everything, saying there'd been a death in the family. I then called all the vendors and canceled the flowers, cake, photographer, and music. When Dorothy arrived at the venue in her renewal dress, she found an empty hall with confused staff who said she'd canceled that morning. She tried to explain it wasn't her, but they had recorded the cancellation call from her number, which I'd spoofed using an app. 300 guests arrived to no party, and Dorothy had to stand there explaining that someone had sabotaged her special day. Next was Dorothy's retirement party from her job as a school principal, where she expected speeches and recognition for 30 years of service. I called in a bomb threat to the school that morning from a payphone, causing evacuation and cancellation of all events. Dorothy's retirement passed without any acknowledgement because the rescheduled party never had the same attendance or energy. She cried about missing her moment after 3 decades of dedication, but I reminded her that I'd cried too when I was locked in a bathroom during my wedding. The real consequence came during Dorothy's mother's 100th birthday celebration. The entire extended family was flying in from around the world for this once-in-a-lifetime milestone. I called Dorothy's siblings and told them she'd said the party was canceled because her grandmother was too sick. I called Dorothy and told her the venue had moved to a different location an hour away. Dorothy drove to the wrong place while her 100-year-old mother waited at the correct venue, wondering where her daughter was. By the time Dorothy figured out the deception and arrived at the right place, it was too late. Over 200 people missed the celebration because of me and Eliana's face when Dorothy finally showed up. Must have been heartbroken. I sat on my couch staring at my phone, waiting for Kevin to come home from his parents' house, but he didn't text or call all night. The next morning, I went to work like nothing happened, answered emails, attended meetings, and pretended I was a normal person, instead of someone who just sabotaged an elderly woman's milestone birthday. June texted me asking how the weekend went, and I lied, saying it was fine, because I couldn't admit what I'd done even to my best friend. Kevin finally came home that Tuesday evening with a bag from his parents' house, and told me he needed space to think. He slept in the guest room for 3 nights straight, barely speaking to me except to ask where the coffee filters were, or if I'd paid the electric bill. On Friday morning, someone knocked on our apartment door at 7:30, and when I opened it, 2 detectives stood there with badges and serious expressions. They asked if I was home and if they could come inside to ask some questions about some incidents involving my mother-in-law. I let them in because saying no would have looked guilty, and they sat on our couch asking about my whereabouts on specific dates, whether I had alibis, if I knew anything about spoofed phone calls or vendor cancellations. One detective, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight, showed me printouts of call records and asked if I recognized any of the numbers. I said I didn't know anything about it, but my voice shook and I kept touching my hair, which I do when I'm nervous. The male detective asked if I'd ever been to the school where Dorothy worked, and I remembered the payphone I'd used for the bomb threat and wondered if they had security footage. They asked about my relationship with Dorothy, whether we got along, if there had been any conflicts between us. I mentioned the wedding bathroom incident because they probably already knew about it, and the female detective wrote something in her notebook without looking up. They thanked me for my time and said they'd be in touch if they had more questions, and after they left, I sat on the floor hyperventilating. I called a lawyer that afternoon, someone June's cousin had used for a DUI, and made an appointment for Monday morning. The lawyer's office was in a strip mall next to a nail salon, and he looked younger than me, which didn't inspire confidence. He listened to everything I'd done, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He explained I could face charges for filing a false bomb threat, which was a felony that could mean actual prison time, plus fraud for the vendor cancellations and harassment for the coordinated sabotage campaign. The bomb threat was the serious one, he said, because it involved terrorism charges and cost the school district thousands in emergency response. He asked if I'd left any digital footprint, if I'd used my own phone or computer for any of it, whether anyone saw me at the payphone. I told him about the spoofing app and using cash for the payphone, and he said that was smart, but the police were good at finding evidence. He quoted me $3,000 for a retainer and said we should wait to see if charges were actually filed before doing anything. I paid with a credit card Kevin didn't know about and left feeling sick. Kevin called me that Wednesday, his voice flat and distant, saying his family knew everything because Dorothy had shown them evidence linking me to all 3 incidents. She had call records, emails from vendors confirming cancellations, testimony from family members about the fake calls they'd received. His Aunt Bonnie had recorded the call where I pretended to be Dorothy canceling the birthday party, and a tech-savvy cousin had traced some of the spoofed numbers back to the app I'd used. Kevin said his family was demanding I face legal consequences, and some of them wanted to press charges. He asked me if it was true, if I'd really done all of it and I couldn't lie anymore, so I admitted everything. He was quiet for a long time, then said he needed more time to process and hung up. I didn't hear from him for 4 days. June came over that Friday night with wine and takeout, and I finally told her everything I'd done. She looked shocked at first, then disappointed, which felt worse than anger. She asked why I'd gone so far, why I hadn't just talked to Dorothy, or gone to therapy, or done literally anything else besides systematic revenge. I tried to explain about the wedding humiliation, about feeling powerless and wanting Dorothy to understand what she'd done to me, but June just shook her head. She said making a 100-year-old woman miss her own birthday was cruel no matter what Dorothy had done to me. 2 weeks later, Kevin texted me that his grandmother Eliana had suffered a minor stroke. The message was short, just the facts, no emotion or extra words. The doctor said the stress and disappointment from missing her birthday celebration likely contributed to it. She was stable but had some weakness on her left side and trouble with certain words. Kevin didn't call or ask me to visit the hospital, just sent that one text and nothing else. I read it over and over, sitting in my car in the work parking lot, and something broke inside me. I'd genuinely hurt an innocent elderly woman who'd never done anything to me, who didn't even know about the wedding bathroom incident, who was just Dorothy's mother trying to celebrate her 100th birthday. The guilt hit me like a physical weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I drove home and threw up in the bathroom, then lay on the floor crying until my throat was raw. That night I couldn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling thinking about Eliana in a hospital bed with stroke symptoms, because I'd been so focused on hurting Dorothy that I didn't care about collateral damage. The next few days I couldn't eat, just drank coffee and felt nauseous all the time. I'd start crying at random moments, in the grocery store or at my desk at work or while brushing my teeth. My boss asked if I was okay and I lied, saying I had a stomach bug. June checked on me daily, but I could tell she was worried about my mental state. Kevin still wasn't coming home or responding to my calls. The school district pressed charges over the bomb threat in early November, and my lawyer called to say this was serious, and we needed to prepare for court. The district had spent over $15,000 on emergency response, evacuating the building, bringing in bomb-sniffing dogs, counseling for traumatized staff and students. Teachers had described genuine terror, not knowing if they were in danger, worried about their students' safety. My lawyer said the prosecutor was pushing for jail time because of the severity, and because I'd shown no remorse initially. He asked if I was willing to plead guilty and show accountability, which might reduce the sentence. I said yes because I was guilty and everyone knew it. Dorothy's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter to my apartment, delivered by certified mail, so I had to sign for it. The letter demanded I have no contact with any family members, not Dorothy or Kevin or anyone else, and threatened a civil lawsuit for emotional distress and financial damages. It itemized costs from all 3 sabotaged events, including the venue deposits Dorothy lost, the vendor cancellation fees she had to pay, the cost of rebooking her anniversary party that never happened, and the emotional distress of missing her mother's milestone birthday. The total was over $40,000. I showed the letter to my lawyer, and he said Dorothy had a strong case for a civil suit on top of the criminal charges. June helped me find a therapist who specialized in anger management and destructive behavior patterns, and I made an appointment for the following week. The therapist's office was in a converted house with plants everywhere and soft lighting that was probably supposed to be calming. She asked me to explain why I was there, and I told her everything, starting with the wedding bathroom incident and ending with Eliana's stroke. She listened without judgment, taking occasional notes, and when I finished, she asked what I'd actually gained from hurting Dorothy. I sat there trying to think of an answer but couldn't come up with anything good. I hadn't felt better or vindicated or satisfied. I just created more pain and hurt innocent people and destroyed my marriage. The therapist said that was an important realization, and we'd work on understanding why I'd chosen revenge over healthier coping mechanisms. After 3 weeks of separation, Kevin agreed to meet me for coffee at a place near his office. He looked exhausted when he walked in, older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes and tension in his shoulders. We sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence until the barista called out our orders. I tried to apologize, to explain my rage over the wedding humiliation and how it had consumed me, but Kevin cut me off. He said I'd become exactly what I hated about his mother, someone who hurts people to feel powerful and in control. He said his grandmother was doing physical therapy to regain strength in her left side, that she still had trouble finding certain words, that the doctor said she might never fully recover. He asked how I could live with knowing I'd caused that, and I didn't have an answer except that I couldn't live with it, that the guilt was eating me alive. Kevin said he didn't know if he could stay married to someone capable of that level of cruelty, that he was questioning everything he thought he knew about me. His assessment cut deep because I recognized the truth in it, that I'd let my need for revenge turn me into exactly the kind of person I despised. Victor called Kevin 3 days after the stroke and told him Dorothy was falling apart at the hospital. She sat by her mother's bed every single day from morning until the nurses made her leave at night, holding her hand and whispering apologies that nobody could hear. Kevin relayed this information to me in a flat voice during one of our brief phone conversations, and I could tell he was watching to see if I felt anything about what I'd done. I felt everything, actually. But the guilt was so heavy I could barely function enough to get through each day. My lawyer called me in for a meeting the following week and explained the prosecutor's offer across his cluttered desk covered in case files. If I pleaded guilty to misdemeanor harassment charges, they would drop the felony bomb threat charge that could send me to prison for years. I would face 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, mandatory therapy sessions twice a week, and restitution payments to everyone I'd hurt. The number he mentioned for restitution made my stomach turn because I didn't have that kind of money, but he said I could make payments over time. I signed the plea agreement that afternoon because there was no point pretending I wasn't guilty of everything they accused me of doing. The prosecutor's office sent me a list of required written apologies as part of the agreement, and I had to write formal letters to Dorothy, to her mother, to the school district, and to every family member who'd been affected by my sabotage campaign. I sat at my kitchen table for hours trying to find words that could possibly convey how sorry I was for what I'd done to an innocent woman who'd never hurt me. Writing to Dorothy was hard because I still carried anger about the wedding, but writing to her mother was impossible because she'd done nothing except have a daughter who made terrible choices. I finally managed to write something honest about how my need for revenge had blinded me to the harm I was causing people who had nothing to do with our conflict. Kevin came by the apartment to pick up some of his clothes and told me he couldn't even think about reconciliation until he saw real change and genuine accountability from me over time. He said he was staying with his parents indefinitely because his mother needed support and he needed distance from me to process everything. I asked if there was any chance for us and he said maybe, but not now and not soon. After he left, I called June and asked if I could stay with her for a while because being in our apartment alone felt like living in a tomb of everything I'd destroyed. She said yes immediately and helped me pack a bag that same night, not asking questions or making me explain beyond what I'd already told her. My first therapy session happened in that converted house office with plants everywhere, and the therapist asked me to walk through the wedding day incident in detail. I described being locked in that bathroom, hearing the music start and stop, running to the altar with smeared makeup while 200 people stared at me like I was unstable. She asked why that particular humiliation felt so unbearable that I needed to respond with such extreme revenge, and I realized I didn't have a good answer beyond the burning rage that had consumed me. Over the next several sessions, she helped me understand that Dorothy's sabotage had triggered something deeper about feeling powerless and controlled, about being humiliated in front of everyone I knew and having no way to defend myself. I started seeing that I'd recreated the exact same power dynamic with Dorothy, that I'd hated so much, just with our roles reversed and with innocent people caught in the crossfire. The therapist pointed out that I'd become the person who locked someone out of their important moments, who made someone feel powerless and humiliated, who hurt people to feel in control. Kevin's aunt called him to say that his grandmother was discharged from the hospital with some remaining speech problems, and that she was organizing a small make-up birthday celebration at her house. I wasn't invited, and Kevin made that explicitly clear when he told me about it, saying his extended family wanted nothing to do with me after what I'd caused. I had to sit with the knowledge that I'd permanently damaged my relationship with people who might have become my family if I hadn't been, so focused on hurting Dorothy that I didn't care who else got hurt. My therapist received a call from Dorothy's therapist 6 weeks into my treatment, asking if I would be willing to participate in a mediated conversation between the two of us. The idea terrified me because I didn't know what Dorothy would say or how I would handle being in the same room with her, but I agreed because I owed her at least that much after everything. The mediator explained in our preliminary phone call that this wasn't about reconciliation or forcing us to be friends, but about both of us taking real accountability for our actions and understanding the cycle we'd created. The mediation session took place in a neutral office with comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the table between us, and Dorothy looked older and more tired than I'd ever seen her. The mediator asked Dorothy to speak first about her experience, and she talked about the wedding day with tears running down her face. She said she'd been scared of losing Kevin to someone she thought was trying to replace her in his life, and she'd acted out of fear rather than thinking about how her actions would affect me. Dorothy admitted that locking me in that bathroom was wrong and cruel, that she'd humiliated me in a way I didn't deserve. But then her voice got stronger when she talked about what I'd done to her family. She described visiting her mother in the hospital every day, watching her struggle to form words, knowing that her daughter's revenge campaign had contributed to the stroke that might have permanent effects. I sat there listening and realized I'd never really thought about Dorothy as a whole person with her own fears and pain, just as an enemy who needed to be punished. The mediator asked me to respond, and I had to acknowledge out loud that nothing Dorothy did to me on my wedding day justified what I'd done to her mother. I looked at Dorothy and saw genuine pain in her eyes when she talked about almost losing her mother, about missing that 100th birthday celebration, about the guilt that was eating her alive just like mine was eating me. We were both crying by the end of the session, not because we'd forgiven each other or become friends, but because we finally recognized the real damage we'd caused each other and everyone around us. The mediator helped us see that we'd both acted from fear and hurt, creating a cycle of retaliation that spiraled way beyond what either of us had originally intended. Dorothy said she never meant to humiliate me as severely as she did, that she just wanted to delay things and make me seem nervous, not destroy my wedding day completely. I admitted that I never considered the collateral damage my revenge would cause, that I'd been so focused on making Dorothy suffer that I didn't think about her mother or the school staff or anyone else who got hurt. The mediator called us back 3 weeks later, and this time Kevin came with us. He sat between Dorothy and me in that same neutral office with the tissue box on the table, and his jaw was tight when he started talking. He told us both that he loved us, but he couldn't have relationships with people who hurt others just to manage their own pain. His voice stayed calm, but I could see his hands shaking slightly when he said we both needed to show real change over time, not just apologize and expect everything to be fine. Dorothy started crying and reached for his hand, but he pulled back gently and said he needed space from both of us until we could prove we were actually different people than we'd been during this whole mess. The mediator asked if he wanted to say more, and Kevin looked at me with this exhausted expression that made my chest hurt. He said the woman he married wouldn't have done what I did to his grandmother, and the mother he grew up with wouldn't have locked someone in a bathroom on their wedding day, so he didn't know who either of us really were anymore. Dorothy and I both sat there crying while Kevin explained that love wasn't enough if we kept hurting people, and he was tired of being caught between two people who claimed to care about him, but kept destroying each other and everyone around them. He left before the session ended, and the mediator had to help both of us calm down enough to drive home. My community service started the following Monday at a senior center 3 blocks from my apartment. The coordinator assigned me to help with activities and meal service, which felt appropriate given what I'd done to Eliana. The first day I met residents like Margaret, who told me stories about her grandchildren, and Frank, who needed help cutting his food because of arthritis, and Susan, who got confused sometimes and called me by her daughter's name. Working with them forced me to see elderly people as real individuals, with feelings and memories and families who loved them, not just collateral damage in someone else's fight. Margaret showed me photos of her 100th birthday party from 2 years ago, and talked about how special it was to have all her children there, and I had to excuse myself to cry in the bathroom, because I'd stolen that exact experience from Eliana. Frank asked me one day why I looked so sad, and I told him I'd hurt someone's grandmother really badly, and he patted my hand and said the fact that I felt guilty meant I could still become a better person. I spent 8 hours every Saturday at that center for 6 months, and by the end I knew everyone's names and their favorite foods and which families visited regularly, and which residents sat alone during visiting hours hoping someone would come. Dorothy's letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a cream-colored envelope with careful handwriting. My hands shook when I opened it and saw 3 pages of her neat script explaining everything. She apologized for the wedding day sabotage and said she'd been in therapy for 2 months working on her control issues and her fear of abandonment. Dorothy wrote that she'd been terrified of losing Kevin to someone she thought was trying to replace her, and she'd acted out of panic rather than thinking about how her actions would destroy my wedding day and humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. She didn't make excuses, but she explained that her own mother had been controlling and critical, and she'd promised herself she'd be different, but ended up repeating the same patterns with Kevin. The letter said she understood now that locking me in that bathroom was cruel and wrong, and she'd spent weeks in therapy unpacking why she felt so threatened by me joining the family. Dorothy wrote that she was working on seeing me as a person instead of a threat, and she hoped someday I might be willing to try building something better than the relationship we'd destroyed. She ended by saying she forgave me for what I'd done to her family, even though it would take time to heal from it, and she hoped I could forgive her too, eventually. I read that letter 5 times and cried through every reading because it was the first time Dorothy had acknowledged the real damage she'd caused me, and it helped me understand she'd been acting from pain instead of pure hatred. I spent a week writing my response, drafting and redrafting until I got the words right. I accepted her apology and told her I understood better now that she'd been scared of losing her son, but understanding her motivations didn't erase what she'd done to me on what should have been the happiest day of my life. I acknowledged that my wedding humiliation didn't justify what I'd done to her mother and her family, and I was sorry for causing pain to people who'd never hurt me. I wrote that I was in therapy too, working on my anger and my need for revenge, and I was learning that hurting people back doesn't actually make the original hurt go away. I suggested we continue our parallel therapy work without direct contact for now, giving both of us time to actually change instead of just promising to change. I told her I hoped someday we could figure out how to exist in the same family without destroying each other, but I wasn't ready for that yet, and I didn't think she was either. I mailed the letter on a Friday and felt lighter somehow, like I'd put down something heavy I'd been carrying. Eliana's note came through Kevin 2 weeks later. He texted asking if he could drop something off, and when I opened the door he handed me a small envelope without coming inside. The note was written in shaky handwriting that looked like it took effort to form each letter. Eliana wrote that she forgave me for what I'd done, and she understood I'd been hurting, but she needed time before we could see each other face to face. She said she hoped I'd use this experience to become a better person and learn to handle pain without passing it on to others. She wrote that she'd lived a long life and seen many people make terrible choices, and the ones who mattered were the ones who learned from those choices and grew. Her grace, despite what I'd cost her, made me cry for hours after Kevin left. I sat on my couch holding that note and thinking about how this woman I'd hurt so badly was showing me more kindness than I'd shown anyone during my revenge campaign. I called my therapist and told her about the note, and we spent our next session talking about how to accept forgiveness without minimizing what I'd done to deserve needing it. My therapist started teaching me healthier ways to handle anger and hurt during our sessions. She had me practice setting direct boundaries instead of seeking revenge, and we role-played difficult conversations with her pretending to be Dorothy. I had to learn how to say things like, "What you did hurt me, and I need you to acknowledge that," instead of planning elaborate schemes to hurt her back. June came to one session to help with the role-playing, and she was surprisingly good at mimicking Dorothy's defensive responses. I practiced expressing hurt without attacking and stating what I needed without making threats, and walking away when conversations became too heated instead of escalating. My therapist gave me homework assignments where I had to write down moments when I felt angry, and then write 3 possible responses: one revenge-based, one passive, and one direct and healthy. It was harder than I expected to come up with healthy responses, because my brain automatically jumped to how I could hurt the person back. June and I practiced these conversations over coffee every week, and she'd throw curveballs at me like Dorothy might, forcing me to stay calm and direct instead of getting defensive or aggressive. Kevin called me 6 months after his grandmother's birthday to ask if I'd be willing to try couples counseling. I agreed immediately, even though the thought terrified me because I missed him desperately and wanted to fix what I'd broken. Our first session was awkward and painful, with both of us sitting stiffly on opposite ends of the therapist's couch, avoiding eye contact. The therapist asked us each to describe why we were there, and Kevin said he needed help processing his feelings about my capacity for deception and harm. He said he'd married someone he thought he knew, and then discovered she was capable of systematically destroying his family while lying to his face for months. I had to sit there and listen to him describe how betrayed he felt, and the therapist wouldn't let me defend myself or explain. She said this session was about Kevin expressing his pain, and my job was just to listen and absorb it. Kevin talked about how he'd trusted me completely, and I'd used that trust to gather information about his family that I then weaponized against them. He said he didn't know if he could ever feel safe with me again, because I'd proven I could look him in the eye and lie while plotting to hurt the people he loved. The therapist had us come back twice a week, and each session felt like pulling teeth. Kevin talked about feeling betrayed, not just by my actions, but by my ability to compartmentalize the harm I was causing. He said I'd gone to family dinners and smiled at his relatives while secretly planning their destruction, and that level of deception scared him more than the revenge itself. I had to sit with his hurt and anger without defending myself or minimizing what I'd done, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever experienced. The therapist made me acknowledge specific moments when I'd lied to him, like when he'd asked if I knew anything about his mother's canceled anniversary party, and I'd acted shocked and sympathetic. Kevin cried during one session when he talked about realizing I'd been lying to him for months, and how that made him question everything else in our relationship. He asked if I'd ever really loved him, or if I'd just married him to get closer to his mother for revenge purposes. And I had to convince him through actions, not words, that my love for him was real, even though my actions had been terrible. My first restitution payment went out on the 15th of the month, a check for $800 split between the school district and the vendors Dorothy had paid cancellation fees to. I sat at my kitchen table writing those checks, and seeing the financial cost of my revenge in actual numbers made everything feel more real. The school district sent a payment plan showing I owed them $12,000 total for the emergency response costs and the disruption to their operations. The vendors Dorothy had to compensate totaled another $8,000 from the anniversary party and retirement event cancellations. I'd be paying $400 a month for the next 4 years just to cover what my revenge had cost other people financially, and that didn't include my lawyer fees or therapy costs or the damage to my marriage. I looked at my budget and realized I'd have to skip vacations and new clothes and eating out for years to afford these payments, and the concrete reality of that sacrifice felt appropriate somehow. June came over while I was addressing the envelopes, and she didn't say anything, just sat with me while I cried over the checks. She reminded me that paying money was the easy part compared to living with what I'd done, and she was right. Dorothy and I met with the mediator again 8 months after the grandmother's birthday incident. We'd both been in individual therapy consistently, and the mediator thought we were ready to discuss specific boundaries for coexisting at family events. Dorothy arrived looking thinner and more tired than before, and I probably looked the same to her. We spent 2 hours going through scenarios like holiday dinners and birthday parties, establishing rules about respectful communication, and agreeing to address conflicts directly, rather than through sabotage or manipulation. Dorothy said she'd work on not making passive-aggressive comments about my parenting skills if Kevin and I ever had children, and I promised to tell her directly if she did something that hurt me instead of plotting revenge. We wrote down actual phrases to use when we felt attacked, like, "I need to take a break from this conversation," instead of escalating or retaliating. The mediator had us practice responding to triggering statements. and Dorothy admitted she knew her wedding day behavior had been cruel and controlling. I admitted that my revenge had been disproportionate and had hurt innocent people who'd never done anything to me. We agreed to keep seeing our individual therapists and to check in with the mediator every few months to make sure we were following through on our commitments. Neither of us pretended we'd be friends or that we'd fully forgiven each other, but we acknowledged we both needed to change if we wanted Kevin in our lives. Kevin started showing up at June's apartment where I was staying, first once a week, then twice, then 3 times. He'd text an hour before to ask if I wanted to get coffee or take a walk, and I'd say yes every time, even though my hands shook while getting ready. We met at neutral places like the park or the quiet cafe on 5th Street where nobody we knew went, and we talked about his work at the engineering firm, or my job at the marketing agency, or the weather, or anything that didn't involve his family, or my revenge, or the wreckage of our marriage. He told me about a project he was designing for a new office building downtown, and I listened to him describe load-bearing structures and architectural challenges, grateful for conversation that didn't require me to defend myself or explain my actions. I asked questions about the building's design, and he pulled out his phone to show me sketches, and for 20 minutes we were just 2 people discussing something normal and safe. When he walked me back to June's building afterward, he didn't try to hug me or hold my hand, just said he'd text me later in the week. And I watched him drive away feeling like maybe we could find our way back to something that resembled a relationship. The next time we met, I told him about a difficult client at work, and he offered advice without judgment. And the time after that, he mentioned his dad was having knee surgery, and I asked follow-up questions that showed I cared about his family, even though they probably hated me. We were building something careful and fragile, testing whether we could exist together without the weight of what I'd done crushing every interaction. June caught me getting ready for one of these dates, and she sat on the bed watching me change shirts 3 times. She said she was proud of the therapy work I was doing and the restitution payments I was making and the way I was showing up consistently to try to fix things. But then she said she still had moments where she looked at me and felt uncomfortable knowing what I was capable of when someone hurt me. Her words landed like stones in my stomach because I wanted her to tell me everything was fine and I was forgiven and we could go back to being best friends without any weird tension. Instead, she was being honest about the fact that seeing me plan and execute revenge on an elderly woman had changed how she saw me, and that honesty was harder to hear than anger would have been. I asked if she thought I was a bad person, and she said no, just someone who made really bad choices. When she was hurting and she believed I was working to become better, but that didn't erase her memory of who I'd been during those months of planning sabotage. I thanked her for not lying to make me feel better, and she hugged me, and I left for my date with Kevin feeling like maybe I didn't deserve to feel comfortable yet. Thursday evening, I drove to a community center across town for an anger management support group my therapist had recommended. 12 people sat in a circle of folding chairs in a room that smelled like coffee and floor cleaner, and a woman named Nadine who ran the group asked if anyone wanted to share. A man in his 40s talked about punching a hole in his wall during an argument with his teenage son, and a younger woman described keying her ex-boyfriend's car after he cheated on her, and I listened to their stories feeling less alone in my destructive choices. When Nadine asked if I wanted to share, I said I'd done something really bad to get revenge on someone who'd humiliated me, and I'd hurt innocent people in the process, including an elderly woman who ended up having a stroke. I didn't give details about the wedding or the birthday party, just said I'd let my anger control me for months, and now I was dealing with legal consequences and a damaged marriage and guilt that kept me awake at night. 3 people nodded like they understood, and a man named Robert said it sounded like I was taking real accountability instead of just saying sorry, which actually meant something. Nadine asked what I was doing differently now when I felt angry, and I explained about therapy and learning to set boundaries directly, instead of plotting revenge, and she said that was exactly the kind of work that led to genuine change. I left the meeting feeling like maybe I wasn't a monster, just someone who'd made terrible choices and was trying to learn better ones. Kevin's phone buzzed during our couples therapy session the following week, and he glanced at it and said his mom was inviting him to a family dinner on Sunday, and she'd specifically said I was welcome to come if I felt comfortable. Our therapist asked how I felt about that invitation, and I said it felt like Dorothy was trying to make space for me even though I'd hurt her family badly, which seemed like a significant gesture. Kevin asked if I wanted to go, and I said no. I wasn't ready to sit at a table with his relatives who probably thought I was cruel and unstable, but I appreciated that Dorothy was trying to include me. The therapist said it was okay to recognize someone's effort toward reconciliation, while still maintaining boundaries about what I could handle, and Kevin nodded and texted his mom back saying he'd come alone, but thank you for inviting me. After the session, Kevin drove me back to June's place and said he thought his mother was genuinely working on her behavior in therapy, and I said I believed that based on our mediation sessions, and we sat in his car for a few minutes not saying anything. My therapist helped me draft a letter to our wedding guests during my next individual session, and we spent an hour working on language that took responsibility without making excuses. I wrote that I wanted to apologize for my part in the chaos and ongoing conflict that had disrupted their experience of what should have been a joyful celebration. I explained that I'd been dealing with a difficult situation with my mother-in-law, and I'd handled it poorly, allowing anger to drive my behavior in ways that affected people who'd done nothing wrong. I didn't detail the bathroom incident or the revenge campaign, just said I took responsibility for contributing to an atmosphere of tension and conflict that had made the day uncomfortable for everyone. My therapist helped me remove defensive language and phrases that minimized my role, and we ended up with 3 paragraphs that felt honest without being self-pitying. I sent the letter to 43 people who'd been at the wedding, and over the next 2 weeks I got 17 responses. Most people said they appreciated the apology and hoped Kevin and I were working things out, and 3 people wrote longer messages about their own family conflicts and how hard it was to navigate in-law relationships. June's mother sent a kind note saying she'd always liked me and believed people could grow from their mistakes, and Kevin's college roommate wrote that he'd seen both me and Dorothy behaving badly that day, and he was glad we were both getting help. The responses surprised me because I'd expected judgment or silence, not this measured kindness from people who'd witnessed my humiliation and probably heard about my revenge. Kevin admitted during our next couples session that he was struggling to reconcile the woman who'd planned elaborate revenge against his family with the woman he'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. He said he kept trying to make those 2 versions of me fit together in his head, and he couldn't, and he wasn't sure if he could fully trust me again. His voice cracked when he said it, and I wanted to defend myself or explain or promise I'd never do anything like that again. But our therapist had taught me to just listen when Kevin needed to express his feelings. The therapist said Kevin's feelings were completely valid given what I'd done, and then she asked us both if we thought trust could be rebuilt over time with consistent behavior and transparency. Kevin said he didn't know, but he was willing to try to. I said, I understood if he couldn't trust me, and I'd keep working on being trustworthy, whether we stayed together or not. We sat in heavy silence for the rest of the session, while the therapist talked about patience and realistic expectations, and the long road ahead of us. My boss called me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon and said they were promoting me to senior account manager with a 15% raise. I almost said no because I didn't feel like I deserved good things, when I was still paying for the bad things I'd done. But I remembered my therapist saying I needed to accept positive developments as part of moving forward, instead of staying stuck in shame. I thanked my boss and accepted the promotion, and that evening I calculated that the extra money would let me increase my restitution payments and finish paying everything back 8 months earlier than planned. Dorothy texted me that night saying congratulations on the promotion. Kevin must have told her, and I texted back thanking her and asking how her therapy was going. She said it was hard but helpful, and I said same, and we had a brief exchange about our therapist's different approaches that felt almost normal. Over the next few weeks, we texted occasionally about therapy progress and family updates, and while we weren't friends or even friendly exactly, there was something like mutual respect developing between us. We both acknowledged in our texts that we were works in progress who'd harmed each other and hurt innocent people, and we were both trying to become better versions of ourselves. Kevin showed me videos on his phone of Eliana at a family gathering, laughing at something Ralph said and talking with Bonnie about her garden. Her speech was clearer than it had been right after the stroke, though she still searched for words sometimes and spoke more slowly than before. I watched the videos feeling genuine relief that she was recovering, even though I knew my actions had contributed to her stroke and the difficult recovery process she'd gone through. Kevin said she was doing speech therapy 3 times a week, and the doctors were optimistic about continued improvement. And I said I was glad, and I meant it. He asked if I wanted to move back in together on a trial basis, and my heart jumped in my chest. I said yes, but I understood we were rebuilding from scratch, and he said that was exactly right. He was choosing to try, but he couldn't promise it would work. We agreed I'd move back in the following weekend, and we'd keep doing couples therapy and individual therapy, and we'd take things slowly, and if either of us felt like it wasn't working, we'd be honest about it. I hung up the phone and cried, not from happiness exactly, but from something like hope, mixed with fear and gratitude that he was willing to give us another chance. I moved back in the following weekend with 3 boxes of clothes and my laptop, and Kevin helped me carry everything up the stairs without saying much. The apartment looked the same but felt different, like we were 2 careful strangers sharing space instead of the married couple who'd lived here before everything fell apart. He'd cleaned out half the closet for me and cleared 2 drawers in the dresser, and I put my things away slowly while he made dinner in the kitchen. We ate pasta at the table and talked about work and the weather and safe topics that didn't require us to acknowledge how fragile this felt. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe on his side of the bed, both of us maintaining space between us like there was an invisible line we weren't ready to cross yet. 2 weeks later, Kevin's father, Victor, called to invite us to a barbecue at their house, and I felt my stomach drop when Kevin were accepted for both of us. The drive to his parents' place took 40 minutes, and I spent the whole time picking at my cuticles and rehearsing things to say that might sound normal. When we pulled up, I saw cars already parked in the driveway, and heard voices coming from the backyard, and I had to force myself to open the car door instead of asking Kevin to take me home. Victor was manning the grill when we walked through the gate, and he nodded at me with a neutral expression that wasn't hostile, but wasn't exactly welcoming either. Bonnie stood near the picnic table arranging potato salad and coleslaw, and when she saw me, she gave a tight smile and said hello before turning back to the food. Ralph sat in a lawn chair with a beer, and he looked at me for a long moment before looking away without speaking. I felt Kevin's hand on my lower back guiding me toward a cooler where I grabbed a soda just to have something to hold. The afternoon crawled by with awkward conversations and long silences, where I could feel people watching me and wondering if I was really different, or just pretending. Victor asked Kevin about work, and they talked about construction projects while I stood there nodding and trying to look interested. Bonnie asked me how my job was going, and I gave a brief answer about the promotion, and she said that was nice before excusing herself to check on something in the kitchen. Ralph never spoke directly to me, but I caught him staring a few times with an expression I couldn't read, like he was trying to figure out if I was safe to have around his family. I helped carry food to the table when it was ready, and sat between Kevin and an empty chair, eating slowly, and listening to everyone else talk about relatives and upcoming holidays, and normal family things that I wasn't quite part of yet. Dorothy arrived halfway through the meal carrying a bowl of fruit salad, and the conversation stopped for a beat when she saw me sitting there. She set the bowl on the table and said hello to everyone, including me, and I said hello back in a voice that came out quieter than I meant it to. We made brief eye contact, and I saw something complicated in her expression. Not quite forgiveness, but not the anger I'd seen before either. She sat across from me and served herself food, and we ate in careful silence while the others slowly resumed talking around us. Later, when people started clearing plates, I followed Dorothy into the kitchen with a stack of dirty dishes, and we stood at the sink together rinsing and loading the dishwasher without speaking. The silence felt different from the hostile quiet from before, more like two people who'd hurt each other badly and were trying to figure out how to exist in the same space. She handed me a serving platter to dry, and I took it without our hands touching, and we worked through the pile of dishes in this strange, careful dance of avoidance and coexistence. When we finished, Dorothy went back outside, and I stayed in the kitchen for a minute, catching my breath and telling myself I could do this. Through the window, I saw Kevin talking with his father and Bonnie laughing at something Ralph said, and it looked like a normal family gathering except for the underlying tension that came from everyone knowing what I'd done. I was about to go back outside when I heard a car door and saw Eliana walking slowly toward the backyard with Victor holding her arm. My heart started pounding and my hands went cold because I hadn't known she was coming and I wasn't prepared to face her. Kevin saw her and smiled, going over to hug her and help her to a comfortable chair, and I watched through the window feeling frozen in place. Dorothy brought her mother a plate of food and a glass of water, and everyone gathered around asking how she was feeling and telling her she looked good. I knew I needed to go out there, but my legs wouldn't move, and I stood in the kitchen trying to remember what my therapist had said about facing the people I'd harmed and taking responsibility for my actions. I finally forced myself to walk outside, and Eliana looked up when I approached, her eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. I knelt down next to her chair so we were at eye level, and my voice shook when I told her I was sorry for what I did, and that I knew missing her birthday was my fault. She looked at me for a long moment, and I waited for anger or coldness or rejection, but instead she reached out and took my hand in hers. Her skin felt thin and papery, and her grip was weak but steady, and she told me she could see I was trying to be better, and that's what mattered now. Her voice was slower than I remembered, and she had to search for some words, but her meaning was clear, and her eyes were kind in a way I didn't deserve. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, and I thanked her and squeezed her hand gently before standing up and walking quickly toward the house. I made it to the bathroom and locked the door before the crying started, sitting on the edge of the tub with my face in my hands, while relief and guilt crashed over me in waves. I'd expected her to hate me, and instead she'd shown me grace, and somehow that made the guilt worse because it reminded me of how badly I'd hurt someone who'd never done anything to deserve it. Over the next few weeks, Kevin and I started building new patterns in our relationship, including a rule that we had to talk about conflicts right away, instead of letting hurt feelings grow into something bigger. The first time Dorothy made a comment about my cooking that stung, I told Kevin immediately instead of stewing on it or planning some petty revenge. He listened and then helped me have a calm conversation with his mother, where I explained that the comment hurt my feelings, and she apologized and said she was working on being more mindful of her words. It felt strange and uncomfortable to address things directly like that, but it also felt better than carrying around anger and plotting ways to hurt her back. Dorothy started making more effort too, texting me to ask my opinion about holiday plans, and including me in family email chains about upcoming gatherings. When she accidentally left me off an email about Christmas dinner arrangements, she noticed within an hour and sent a separate message apologizing and adding me to the thread. These small gestures felt significant because they showed she was actively trying to change her behavior, not just apologizing and then going back to her old patterns. My final community service shift at the senior center came on a Wednesday afternoon, and my probation officer showed up to observe and sign off on my completion paperwork. She watched me help residents with their lunch and lead an activity group, and afterward she told me she'd seen hundreds of people go through court-ordered programs without any real change in their behavior or thinking. She said most people just went through the motions to satisfy their legal requirements, but she believed I was actually doing the work to become a better person. Her words made me emotional because I'd spent months feeling like I was irredeemably broken, and having someone official recognize my genuine effort felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. She signed my completion certificate and shook my hand, and I walked out of the center feeling like I'd closed one chapter, even though I knew the emotional work would continue for much longer. Kevin and I celebrated our second anniversary quietly at home with takeout and a movie, and at some point during the evening we started talking about how different this year had been from our wedding day. He said he was glad we were still together after everything that happened, but he acknowledged that we both carried scars from the wedding disaster, and the revenge campaign, and the months of separation and therapy. I told him I was grateful he'd been willing to give me another chance when he could have just walked away and started over with someone who hadn't caused so much damage. We sat close on the couch, and he put his arm around me, and it felt comfortable in a way it hadn't since before I got arrested. The ease between us was still fragile, and we both knew it, But there was something real growing in the space where trust used to be. Something we were building together instead of just assuming it would exist. Dorothy texted me 3 weeks after Thanksgiving asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. Just the two of us without Kevin or any mediators or therapists present. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding yes, and we agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between our houses on Saturday morning. I arrived early and sat in a corner booth watching the door, my hands wrapped around a mug that was already getting cold. She walked in wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual put-together outfits, and she looked as nervous as I felt. We made awkward small talk about the weather and the cafe's pastries, before she finally said she wanted to understand where my anger came from. Not to excuse what I did, but to understand it better. I told her about growing up with a mother who criticized everything I did, and made me feel like I was never good enough, and how the wedding day felt like that same dynamic all over again with her deciding I wasn't worthy of her son. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, and she told me her own mother had been cold and distant, always comparing her to more successful siblings, and she'd spent her whole life trying to prove she was valuable by controlling everything around her. We talked for 2 hours about our families and the patterns we'd learned and were trying to unlearn, and by the end we weren't friends, but we understood each other in a way we hadn't before. The letter from the school district arrived on a Tuesday in a plain white envelope with the district logo in the corner. I opened it standing in my kitchen and read that my restitution was paid in full, and they appreciated my compliance with the court order and cooperation throughout the process. The letter thanked me for taking responsibility and wished me well moving forward. I sat down at the table and cried, not from relief but from the weight of knowing this chapter was officially closed, even though the emotional work would never really be finished. Kevin found me there an hour later still holding the letter, and he sat next to me without saying anything, just putting his hand over mine. June came over that evening with takeout, and we ate on my couch like we'd done hundreds of times before. She told me she was proud of how far I'd come, and that she saw real change in how I handled conflict and disappointment now. Her words meant everything because she'd witnessed both my worst behavior and my genuine efforts to become better, and she knew the difference between someone just going through the motions and someone actually doing the work. She said I still had a long way to go, but I was moving in the right direction, and that was what mattered. The invitation to the 101st birthday celebration arrived with a handwritten note from Dorothy, saying she hoped I would come and help her coordinate the details this time. Kevin and I drove to the venue together, and I spent the morning setting up decorations and arranging food platters, while Dorothy directed traffic and greeted arriving family members. Bonnie was polite but still kept her distance, and Ralph mostly focused on his own kids. But they didn't leave the room when I entered anymore. I watched Kevin laugh with his grandmother as she told stories about her childhood, and Dorothy caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod. Life wasn't neat or fully resolved, and some family members would probably never fully trust me again, but I was here, and I was trying. Dorothy and I had both come a long way from the people who hurt each other so badly, and we were learning to coexist with our complicated history, while building something more honest going forward.